Okay, well, welcome everybody to the latest Zoom conversation from Leeds Theosophical Society. I was just thinking this morning before we came on air, and it seems like we've been doing these forever almost. They started during the COVID pandemic and have continued very successfully since then. So we've been doing them for roughly 4.5 years, and we have a fantastic diversity of speakers. Not least our conversationalist this afternoon, Brenda Crowther, speaking to us all the way from southwest France, where, like God's own county where she was born, it's covered in snow. So welcome, Brenda, to this conversation. There's a great deal to go at in your very long and illustrious career, so it might be useful, as we often do with these conversations, to ask you where your journey started. Was it in childhood or adolescence or early adulthood, which set you on the particular course which has taken you through your life and your studies, particularly, obviously, in terms of Carl Jung?
Yes, first of all, thank you for asking me. I would say that my journey began as a very young child because I was brought up in the middle of nowhere. My grandfather, who was a very powerful person and was a benign patriarch, I would say, and he really gave the family a lot of energy, and he found a spring close to his garden and he made a pool of it for the children, and he had 8 children, and he also grew grapes and fruits of all kinds and flowers, and it was for the use of everyone, not for him. And I had a really strong visionary sense in this garden and saw many strange things. And that stayed with me always. So you could say that around 7 or 8 or 9, that age range, where you just begin to leave what we Jungians call the visionary world to come into the world where you become conscious. So then there was a long period, and then finally I became an art student. And that's because I loved painting the scenes all around me in that area. And I came across, at the age of 18, Carl Jung's book, Man and His Symbols, which is still behind me. And there I discovered the mandalas, the artwork, the colours that he used. So for me, it was visual. I met Carl Jung visually. And then I began to dream. And I had a dream which was so strong that it's only more than 50 years later that I understood it. You can hear the dream if you like.
Well, I think that would be very useful to illustrate the general with the specific, of course.
Well, I think I was about 17, so it's more than 50 years. And I was travelling on a train to Coventry. And at that time, this is in brackets now, it's not in the dream, the new cathedral at Coventry had just been inaugurated and rebuilt. So I was travelling on a train to Coventry, and sitting opposite me in one of those train carriages with no corridors was a vicar. And he had those red ecclesiastical socks. And I took a gun out of my pocket and I shot him. And then I got off the train, and in front of me was a great big field. And it had black and white checkerboard, just like a chess board. And across this chessboard were sculptures which had just been cast. I don't know if you know anything about casting, but when a bronze is cast, it leaves all these metal spikes which have to be carved, which have to be sanded down. So I saw all these cast bronzes, many of them. I turned to the left, and there I saw the cathedral. And what did I see first? I saw Jacob Epstein's statue of St. Michael fighting the devil. And there the dream ended. Well, I've kept this dream for many, many years. And suddenly I came across an analyst in America called Sabina Lucas. And she'd made a film, which I think I sent you, Tim, on Jung and reincarnation. And when I watched that film, I understood the dream. And I understood that all those bronzes, which were cast exactly as they were, with, classical statues sometimes have arms missing or legs missing, or they were like that, very classical. And I thought, they're all my lives. They're all my previous lives. That's how they were cast across the field of life. And then I saw my task, good and evil. The fight of good and evil. And what is my personal myth, which I found while studying Jung? Alchemy. And alchemy is the struggle between the opposites. And one of these is good and evil. So all those years later, spanning quite a lot of time, more than 60 years, I found what that dream meant. So that's a story that spreads way beyond.
Well, it shows the very long-term process of all these things which you and other analysts and everything are engaged in. What was it, do you think, that first drew you to wanting to work as an analyst and actually directly with other people? Did that happen early in your life or at a later stage?
No, at a later stage. I worked, first of all, as an art teacher and an art lecturer. I worked at Brighton University for quite a long time. I was a practicing artist. And at 30, I decided that I had to do something different because certain parts of me were undeveloped, especially the practical side. The intuition was working well. I was thinking about things, always read philosophy, all sorts of different things. And I decided to go into the civil service. And I took an exam. And I went into the European section. And I got an exchange to Paris. Now, why did I do that? I met a yoga teacher when I was about 27, and I just had an accident. And the hospital said to my back, the hospital said, we can't do any more. You have to put up with that. But we do know a yoga teacher in Brighton, and she could help you. So I went along to her. And she said, you have to work. So for several years, I got up before the dawn and did these exercises every day. And eventually, no trace remained of the accident. And of course, she was a spiritual woman, and I stayed with her. And just before I decided to train, she looked at me one day, and she didn't look at me, she looked above my head here. And she said to me, Brenda, you need to learn French. I said, oh. So I just began like that. I didn't question it because she proved to me how wonderful she was. So I started. And then I was in the civil service and a chance came up to have an exchange with Paris. And I applied for it, did the tests and got it. And there I realised that I belonged. So I came back, and my teacher had died by this time. In fact, when I was in France. But she came in a dream. And as I'd always loved Jung, and we'd studied Jung and dreams during this process, I said to her in the dream, do you think I should train as an analyst? And she just went, yes. So then I began, and it was very difficult because I was not so academic as the other analyst, and I hadn't studied psychology, and I didn't like modern clinical psychology. I thought it was one-sided. And so I thought, well, how will I begin? And it said on the instructions, you have to have a master's degree. And I thought, well, I can't do psychology. So what did I do? French philosophy. And they were quite pleased because they didn't want people with psychological qualifications either, because it wasn't what it was about. So that's how I got to be an analyst, through a teacher who incidentally was a Sufi.
Now, when you engage with your patients, with the people you analyze, is it a different approach in every case depending on that person? Or is there some kind of standard approach which you take when you're starting to examine a person's inner workings?
It's completely individual. There's no basis from which you can start. Of course, when you're in training, you have to study something. So generally speaking, you study the shadow side of a person. You study their feminine and masculine aspects, which have come to be called the anima, the feminine, the animus, the masculine. The shadow is important. In the West, we have a bad view of the shadow. We think it's everything nasty. But as Jung pointed out, most often, our gifts are hidden in the shadow.
Just to interrupt there, would that shadow be what we in Theosophy and other traditions call the dweller on the threshold?
Yes, it would.
The accumulated detritus from other lives and other experiences which we have to somehow deal with and purify.
Yes, you would begin with what you remembered of this life. Usually, that's as far as most Jungian analysts go. They don't go into the reincarnation aspect, but it's coming up. And that's because of the publication of the Red Book, where there are instances of reincarnation, Jung's experience. But I personally would look into what are the hidden gifts, first of all, because if you're going to go into, say, the experience of the guardian of threshold, which is a serious meeting, what you have to have a very strong personality and a certain degree of consciousness. It can't be met theoretically. There you risk distraction. So one of the things that an analyst prepares you for is, by questioning your life, it's to actually strengthen your personality and help you to face what in this life you've avoided. That strengthens the personality. In Jungian psychology, we call it strengthening the ego. And we make a very big difference between the ego and egoism and egocentrism. So the ego is the structure of the personality. It's not the structure of the self or the inner aspect. But without a strong ego, you're sure to trip up. So
this would be the lower self and the higher self, to put it crudely, would it?
You could put it like that, yes. Michael Ivanov would put it like that. So your lower self needs to be strengthened because you're in this life, you're incarnated. Your material is here. Therefore, it has to be strong to withstand the higher self, which is not to be underestimated in its effect, its fire, its potentiality to create and destroy. And we must never forget the opposite of what you're dealing with.
Okay. When people come to you, do they come just because they want to understand themselves better and understand their own inner psychology, or do they come with specific issues, or is it a bit of both?
It's generally much more individual than that. You've given two options, but often they don't come for any of those. Some people come because they have an intuition or they've read about Jung and they want the experience. So I would say people who come for Jungian psychology want an experience. They generally don't want a cure. They don't want to resolve their difficulties. But often they present that way. So one of the tasks of an analyst is to see, why are they presenting that way? And is it because they've got to say something? You can't just say, well, here I am. Well, you can, but the analyst would say, well, what made you come? I usually say, what brought you? What brought you here? And some people will say, oh, well, I had a dream. So then my ears prick up. They had a dream. Or some people say, I'm low in confidence. And immediately you're given a clue that they want to go somewhere, but they can't because their ego is not strong enough. They're not strong enough to meet the strangest of experiences which you would meet. I'll give you an example if you like. I had a young woman, not from this country, and she presented as a psychotic. But the more I listened, the more I thought, oh, I don't think this is psychotic. What could this be? So I spoke to her for a few sessions, and then it came. I thought, she's a shaman. She's been treated in a country with an over-rational clinical approach to psychology. And what she was getting was not a psychosis, but a shamanic trance. So these are difficult, which means that during your training, you study a lot of psychiatry and psychopathology to make this difference between a visionary and a real psychotic, because you must know the difference. And that's why you have to spend some time in a serious clinic looking at people who all have visions for different reasons.
One presumes that this whole process, when you engage with someone, it's a complicated and a elongated process, I imagine. You can't achieve things in a few weeks, I imagine, or can you?
Oh, it's so variable, you wouldn't believe it. Some people have one session and it's done. Others are here for 15 years. And there are variables in between. Especially young people. I never really liked to keep young people for long because I felt that they should be strengthening themselves out in the world, not spending time with me. So I once had a 15-year-old and her mother brought her and said that she was suffering from violence. I thought, oh, that's strange. She looked very benign. And her mother left, and I said, well, what is it that your mother's saying? Oh, she said, I had a boyfriend and I threw a hamburger at him. I said, well, why did you throw the hamburger? She said, well, he insulted me. I said, well, what did he say? She said, something, I can't remember. I said, well, I might have been insulted if he'd said that. And I might have thrown a hamburger at him if it was within reach. She said, oh. I said, well, why did your mother think that was violence? Well, she was a social worker and conditioned to see everything through certain ways. So I said to this young woman, well, it seems you've got a very healthy psyche. Just don't put up with insults anymore. Finish.
While we're on the subject of young people, I often have conversations with people, and there seems to be this perception that there is a deep malaise amongst our youngsters, especially children, and often things like social media and overuse of mobile devices and all these things are brought into the mix and put in as part of the equation. Are the young people of today any more alienated, depressed, socially isolated, than their forebears from our generation, for example? Has something changed? Is there a crisis, or do we overestimate this, do you think?
This is a complex question because when you give such a description, naturally you're subject to a projection. And so young people become something generic, not a cluster of individuals. And you say young people are, young people are. But that's not the story. Also, some of that rests with adults in that we expect a lot of young people. We think they're inheriting, and that gives us time to sit back. But what they need is that we should also remain extremely young within. But often the generation see the young people as the inheritors, and the older generation forget to look for their young heart. So that's part of it. Then there's the research into what psychology does to the brain. And there's no doubt that it needs limiting. Now, this was under discussion. I don't know if you've heard of this very great woman called Irina Tweedy. She was a Sufi teacher and went to India. And she used to hold sittings in London, some of which I would go to. The reason being that my own teacher said, I've found someone greater than me and I want you to meet her. So we went. And someone asked this question and she said, you have to think long term. These people who are involved in social media and go at great speed and don't seem to concentrate in depth, she said they're being speeded up for a purpose that is hidden from us. So there's that also. So it's quite a complex question. So they're being speeded up for a purpose we don't know. They're suffering a bit now. When I think of previous generations regarding your question on social isolation, yes, that's so. But when I think of my mother, brought up in a Victorian household and not allowed to go out unless she was accompanied, she also suffered from isolation, but in a different way. So I think no more than previously. The thing which I regret personally, which I could even project onto the young, is that I do wish they could discuss more. But how can they discuss if we can't take what they're saying, if we want them to change and we don't listen? So our task is to listen, and anyone who's over 60, 65 is in the region of a threshold person who looks back over a long period and looks forward, probably with quite a few years left. So they're threshold people, and they have a responsibility, married, unmarried, single or not, to prepare the young people they meet by their attitude, not by classes, just by having an attitude of listening and understanding.
Well, I think that's wonderful advice, and I'm fortunate enough to have a number of young friends myself, and I learn an awful lot from them. And obviously, you can't stereotype people into demographic groups or anything like that. That's rather pointless. But it is often said, Brenda, that the West is experiencing some kind of overall mental malaise. People call it a mental health crisis in the newspaper headlines and that sort of thing. Is this another illusion, or is there something real and tangible to this? Are people somehow suffering inwardly, mentally, in a way that's quite different from what happened in the past? Because obviously people lived in terrible conditions in the past, and no doubt that depressed them. When if you were living in some horrible Victorian slum and working down a coal mine, that was horrible. But has something changed? Is there something in the modern world which is conspiring against human beings' inner spirit, if you like?
Most certainly. I'll say what I've noticed about this. I noticed round about 2012 that people's problems were manifesting naturally, personally. They were suffering from something. But what I began to notice more and more was that they were suffering from the effects of what the world was bringing onto them, but they were not suffering from a personal problem which was coming from within. So when I look further into this, I thought, yes, there's a change of civilization coming. And Jung, of course, speaks about this, and he speaks about the degradation. He speaks about how we will have to go through quite a terrible time. He gives reasons. He's sad that people haven't listened to their souls. But I think there is in the West not a malaise, but a violence against people's souls, which young people feel more easily. And that violence is concerned with the disintegration of the West, which is slowly disintegrating as we lose, you can call it a moral compass. And by moral compass, I don't mean conventional morality. I mean a sense of what is truthful on the inner level. This has been poked at and irritated, so people can't feel what the truth is anymore. Even our news, if we want to look collectively, do you know anyone who fully trusts the BBC anymore?
Well, I certainly don't, and I worked with them for more than 15 years, so I know how the BBC actually works. What you say is absolutely fascinating here, because it strikes me that this attack on the soul, because that's effectively what it was, and that's, I suppose, what Jung and indeed others were forewarning many decades ago. Is this some kind of purification process for humanity? Is it some sort of elevation in its own consciousness? Is it a reconnection with these noble virtues like truth, beauty, harmony, and those things which seem to be lost of the past? Is it an awakening of some kind, all this that's going on in the world at the moment?
In the long term, I would say yes, because we are. I would like to say that we're approaching bad time, but I think we're in it. I think there's no doubt, because sometimes when I see several clients a week, I don't have many now. In England, I had about 30 a week, but here I only have 12. But I notice that often they have the same dreams, and they occur within a time span. And they're not just dreaming of sea or moon, which are fairly archetypal symbols, which are recurrent. They'll dream of something quite specific, like an inland saltwater pool, which is almost impossible. So several people might have the same dream in 1 week. And so the first question I have to ask myself, not what is troubling the person, but what on earth is going on in the world? What are they picking up? And then I have to look in the world. So I have to take myself out of my consulting room and I have to see what's going on. And of course, I have international clients, so they're in different countries. So I've got Ukrainian, Russian. I had a Syrian, but she's gone. Sweden, America, Canada, England, France, Italy. So the dreams that are the same are international. What on earth is going on in the world?
Well, this is an excellent illustration, isn't it, of Jung's idea of a collective unconscious.
There's something speaking through the collective unconscious, which is expressing itself through an affect. It's a bit like when you see a picture of the atom bomb, that's an affect. What is the archetype? What is the unconscious? Well, it's the power that brings about the explosion, which is invisible. So there are invisible powers at work. And the thing that's needed most of all is that we have to strengthen ourselves. Often this is given to us through suffering, which forces us to resist. And as soon as you get something resisting, it begins to strengthen. You know, you strengthen a muscle by resisting. a weight or whatever, and you strengthen your mind waves or whatever by resisting, by continually reflecting on what is the truth in this terrible situation, and by not letting that go, so that you sink into passivity. Because the whatever powers there are in the world, and they're pretty seriously evil, they will work towards passivity. It's one reason I quite like the French, because they're so damn reactive. They're really reactive. You only have to lower the pension age by, or increase it by a year, and there are strikes everywhere. And people say, oh, well, we have to wait till we're 67. Why do they want it at 61 and not at 62? But people forget that that's an affect. What they're doing is resisting. And that resistance is building up their strength. And that's what's needed. Passivity, terrible, terrible thing.
Do you think that there is a greater degree of resistance to the current ways that we do things in the world, our sets of governance, our terrible politicians, our corrupt economics, our skewed priorities? Do you think people are beginning to wake up to these kind of things now? Or yeah?
There are two lessons that they learnt, probably unconsciously, from the COVID. One is, why was everyone so passive? Why? And then suddenly, after it was finished, the French got their reactivity back. How many people in England said to me, what's wrong with the French? They're not reacting against this COVID affair. Because it's their national temperament. I can't say it's bad or good, it's just their national temperament. And suddenly they've got it back. But part of it has come back through violence, and part of it's come back through realization of what they're in. So that is really important in the world, that you have a reaction. And from that reaction, you maybe get a response. The response takes longer to come. So you have your reaction and you think, no. And then you have to reflect. And that's the second stage after reaction.
I think it's very interesting what you say about how the French have got their mojo back, as it were, whereas I think in Britain we are largely passive. I'm not sure we were always this way, but I think we have become largely passive. And that's in contrast to France, and also to another place I visit a lot, which is Greece, where the people there are very fiery people, and they don't like these things, and they protest against government cover-ups, corruption, and all these things. It doesn't change very much, but at least they're there on the streets. You can't walk through Athens without there being a demonstration of some kind. And that is in stark contrast to what happens in Britain. Obviously, we have protests and everything in Britain, and there is a general awakening. But it's interesting, isn't it, to see different national characteristics and how they play out in these world affairs.
Mm. Yes, it's we're right in the middle of a massive transformation. And we really all have to be active within. And not everyone is constituted to be active extrovertedly. But there are others of us, of which I count myself one, who are inner activists, who would work consistently as long as possible with a soul, say a patient, a soul, so that that soul becomes more living and more vital. Never mind whether it's right or wrong. We're not here to do that stuff. But is their soul vital? Is their spirit alive? That is the work. That's what will combat the evil that is descending on us. And when I say evil, please don't underestimate that word. I don't mean nastiness. I mean evil, because we can all be nasty at times, but it's not that. It's something quite different.
And this has existed, as far as we know, on the inner planes since time immemorial, we won't say when, but these inner forces, this inner conflict of darkness and light, which occasionally erupts onto the outer planes, is something which I think more and more people are beginning to notice. What I'd like to ask you, during my adult lifetime, there's just been an increasing interest in the works of Carl Jung. I started reading his works when I was still a teenager. I read some of his collected works on alchemy, which is something I've studied for a great many years, and found his work fascinating. Back in the 70s, a lot of people then were still talking about Freud and, to a lesser extent, Adler and one or two others. But Freud seems to have dipped way below the radar, whereas Jung has ascended into prominence, particularly after the publication of the Red Book in 2009. Why do you think that is the case? Why do you think Freudianism is something which isn't really discussed in mainstream circles anymore, but Jung, remains center stage in some way?
I think that there are several reasons. One is that we've changed era. We've come from Pisces and into Aquarius. Depending on which astrologer you consult, they'll have a different date, but it's within a period. So into the age of Aquarius comes Jung's Red Book, which previously wasn't allowed to be published by the Jung family, who didn't want to tarnish Jung's respectful persona, if you like, of being a good doctor and contributing a bit of structural stuff, animus anima, shadow ego, to the development of humanity. But then the Red Book came. I myself felt it immediately. Then, of course, there are other people intertwined with Jung. For me, the 20th century in particular had many great spiritual teachers. I could think of quite a few, for instance, Steiner, Gurdjieff, Mikhail Ivanov in France, and of course Jung. And they were saying very similar things, but they were making room for different kinds of people. The person who would read Steiner might not be the person who would read Jung, but they would receive a message in accordance with what their soul was searching for. So that 20th century seemed to be a whole preparation for this one. And then came the Red Book. So it's quite important Jung is not seen in isolation. That you see that his ideas were there. And he also did not discover individuation. Individuation he named. Also, he gave new terms which allowed modern man to immerse himself in things that he wouldn't normally. For instance, Jung called something a psychological complex. In that way, a modern rational man or woman could approach what could be their complexes. But what was the real name for that in the Middle Ages? It was entity. So people didn't like to think they were possessed by an entity. Far too irrational, but they could cope with being possessed by a psychological complex. So now comes the Red Book, and that begins to diminish, and something deeper comes. And then, of course, if you look back to the late 19th century, Rudolf Steiner gives a date specific, which I don't remember, but it's something like 1897 or 1882. It's in the last 50 years, where he describes a battle between good and evil in the heavens. And he says that good won. He said, but there's still a price to pay. And we will have to pass through difficult, dark times. Jung said the same thing. He put the battle of good and evil into the human psyche.
Yes, and it was interesting the way he regarded what happened during the Second World War and how the German people became infected by an archetype Wotan, I think it was, wasn't it? Or Wotan, the warrior that somehow infected the whole German psyche and soul. I can't think of any other better way of describing what would happen to a previously civilized and rational and inventive people suddenly to be infected with this collective psychosis and madness.
Yes, very serious. We forget about this because, of course, the German people suffered a forced conversion to Christianity. So they were forced to repress or suppress all their previous religious beliefs. So one of those was Wotan, which was the most tempestuous, and all the other nature gods. They were forced to convert by the Inquisition, which passed through Europe at that time. Certain countries got away with it a bit more and have gone back to their nature worship. And one of these is Estonia. But all the Baltic states were nature worshippers. So, with this thin icing of Christian veneer, what was this fire that was held within? And I don't know if you've been into the museum in Berlin and you've seen all the films of Hitler's youth and everything, but you see marchers with holding torches in the night, and they're just enthralling. And you can see how Hitler magnetized people into this ancient way of being, and he broke all the morality of humanitarianism, hence the concentration camps. All that was broken. So it's not the only country. It's possible that Germany carried that for the rest of Europe. It took the projection. It's possible that much of Europe, France, in fact, nowadays there are certain parts of France which are full of sorcerers. The Inquisition wasn't able to suppress them. And an ethnologist went into one of these enclaves to study it. And she studied it. She wrote a very good book, which is very rational. But what happened to her? She was bewitched, and she had to seek out a bewitcher, which exists also in France. It's absolutely widespread. And I myself got bewitched when I lived close to this area in France, and it took me 3 months to get bewitched. So all this stuff, that's a personal experience which was arduous. But all this was suppressed throughout all Europe, so it's no wonder that war erupted.
I think it's interesting what you say about the nature spirits, because here in the United Kingdom, particularly in those parts of it that had a great Celtic influence, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Brittany in France and other places, there is almost a resurgence of these nature-type religions, Wicca, paganism of one sort or another, reviving all sorts of Celtic spiritual practices, and those of indigenous peoples around the world, interest in shamanism and all that sort of stuff. So it almost as if it is as if that current is fundamentally shifting at the moment. And you say these enclaves exist in particular parts of France. Is that the southwest where you're now living?
No. It exists. I used to live in Bourgogne or Burgundy in English. And just to the west, there's an area close to Normandy. And the other part is in the Pyrenees. And there it's quite saturated. And of course, France was, not everyone spoke French in France 500 years ago. They all spoke different languages. And these also were suppressed in favour of a standard French. That was quite helpful. But what of Christianity, we might say? Well, with the suppression of the Inquisition and all the straitjackets, Christianity got lost. So that spirit now has to be discovered in all its truthfulness. Of course, there are vestiges. And in my area, of course, all the Gnostic Christians were annihilated.
Cathars.
The Cathars, they were absolutely annihilated. I probably live in a village where the Cathars were living.
Does this mean that Christianity needs to rediscover and reinvent itself? Or is it past the point of being reformed?
I think we speak of two things here. When you talk about reinvention, etc., naturally that has to do with the collective church, which has done much to destroy Christianity. And can it come back and show a better face? But actually, Christianity probably existed long before Christ. So we're looking at something in another dimension. And the Christ impulse, Steiner would call it the Christ impulse, is another order of reality, which needs a great deal of human experience and research. Of course, you find it among certain mystics, especially the women mystics.
Okay, well, that has been one of the most fascinating conversations I've had in a long time. And thank you so much for sparing the time to go into your life and your work with Jung. And certainly his work has always resonated with me and people who think like I do throughout my life. So I think that's been every time I speak to a Jungian, I get another kind of layer on the sandwich, because each of you, and I know there are one or two people listening this afternoon who are also Jungian analysts, and it's always fascinating to build up these different complex layers and everything. So thank you from snowy Yorkshire.
Yes.
Bye bye, everybody.